Welcome to the USC Emeritus Center Living History Project. My name is Steve Barnhart. I'm the former Director of Student Information Systems Development for the university. And today I'm interviewing Dr. Kenneth Servis, Emeriti Professor of Chemistry and Dean of Academic Records and Registrar. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. I'm glad you're here. Let's talk about some of your background before you came to USC. I believe you joined us as a freshly minted PhD.
I did.
Out of Caltech. So why don't you give us some of that background?
Well, it was a little unusual. I had taken a job at USC in 1964. The university had just won a National Science Foundation Center of Excellence grant in science. And so I accepted a position, and I was supposed to start in September of 1964. But I was approached by the U.S. State Department to participate in a cultural exchange program for a precursor to the Fulbright program in Yugoslavia. So I talked to the university and said, you know, can I take a leave of absence for my first year? And I did, and they were very accommodating, but it was very comforting to me also because then I knew where I was going to be when I came back. Right. So I'd been a graduate student at Caltech. I spent 9 months in Yugoslavia doing postdoctoral research and then started my career here in June of 1965.
I know you did your undergraduate work in Indiana at Purdue. What was the allure of Southern California as an area as well as a university?
Well, I did. I was an undergraduate at Purdue, and I was there because I grew up in a small town about 15 miles from Purdue, a small rural community. And actually, when I was graduating, I was taking a senior organic analysis course, and in April, the professor asked me what I was doing, and I said, well, I'm very lucky. I've got a job with Union Carbide. I'm going off to be a chemist. And he said, well, you don't want to do that. You want to get a graduate degree. And I said, well, I don't know. He said, oh, yes. And so he said, well, it's really too late to apply, but I know the professors at Caltech, and I think I can get you in. So he made a few telephone calls, and I got an offer from them, and I thought, well, California can't be bad, so here I am.
Winters are better?
Winters are much better. I didn't go back to Indiana.
Right. So what was the university like when you got here in the mid-'60s?
Well, the university was, as I said, it had just received a Center of Excellence grant. Norman Topping was then the president. I had been working hard to develop the university, but the chemistry department was in sort of flux. There were a number of older senior professors who were here. The best organic chemistry professor had just left for Yale, and there was one other older senior organic professor who was mostly a teacher, and 2 young assistant professors. And so when I came, we knew we were going to have to do development of the department, and so that was part of my charge, is to try to develop the organic chemistry section and do hires and stuff like that. So I spent much of my first few years chairing search committees and entertaining candidates for positions, and we continually were trying to hire senior professors because we really needed some leadership there. And so made a number of efforts, and Norman Topping was particularly helpful. He would meet candidates and would provide us with help with arrangements and give us tickets to the newly opened Dorothy Chandler Pavilion.
Oh, yes.
So it was nice.
Very good. Is that unusual for a first-year hire to be involved so much in that type of activity?
Yeah, it was, but it was something that needed to be done, and I knew that for the department to develop, I was going to have to help do it. And it was something I found interesting to do, so yeah, it worked out fine.
Okay. Was there anyone particular that mentored you in your first stages of your career here?
Well, not particularly. As I said, the older organic professors were not available, and actually my first couple of years were a little traumatic. There was a senior organic professor who had his own company off campus, and there was a great deal of friction between him and the department. And my first meeting in the department chair's office was one in which there was banging on the desk and there was a letter of resignation pulled out, and this guy said, sign this. And so, it was pretty traumatic. And then a couple years later, there were a number of us junior faculty who'd come on, and the older professors were feeling a little uncomfortable, so they had proposed that only tenured faculty would be allowed to vote at faculty meetings. The dean became aware of that and said, no, we're not going to go in that direction. So, yeah.
A little bit of friction.
A little bit of friction.
The young whippersnappers versus the old guard, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I know from reviewing your CV that virtually the whole time you were on the faculty that you were teaching both undergraduate and graduate classes, which is sometimes unusual. Many faculty tend to teach the undergraduate classes while they have to, and then migrate up to the graduate classes and leave the undergraduate behind. Clearly you had an interest in both levels. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, my primary teaching was in the organic chemistry course with 322A and B. It's still chemistry 322A and B, and is a gateway course for the health sciences profession, for MDs, for dental, for nursing. It's one of the make or break courses. If people do well at that, they tend to do well in their professional careers, and if they don't do well in that, they don't get a chance to find out whether they
yeah.
so they don't move on. So it's also a very large course. It was at the time usually 300 students per semester, so you had a lot of teaching assistants and laboratory assistants, and it was a fair amount of work to organize that. We tried a number of different things there to try to help students along. One of the difficulties is that it's a very intensive course that requires recalling a lot of facts, memorization, but it really is developing a language in which you can talk about the chemical concepts. And I was more interested in talking about the chemical concepts, and students are often more interested in getting the facts right. So they would be busy scribbling away, and I was trying to engage them intellectually. And so we tried several different things. One thing I did at one point was to tell them I would give them lecture notes before the class, and so they didn't really have to do scribbling. They could have the lecture notes in advance, and then they could just pay attention and
annotate them, perhaps.
Annotate them and do that sort of thing. Well, it turned out not to be so successful, and I think the reason is because it changed the way they were used to learning. It became a passive learning experience rather than an active learning experience where they write, and so the connection between writing and learning wasn't there. So that didn't work out. The graduate courses I taught were the advanced level physical organic chemistry course. Physical organic chemistry is one of my specialties. So I taught that for several years. And then we developed a graduate course in nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy, and that's one of the other areas of my specialty.
Part of your dissertation, if I remember correctly.
Correct, right. And sort of a backstory to that, when I hired on as an assistant professor, the department had none of the modern instrumentation like nuclear magnetic resonance spectrometers. And so part of the agreement was if I was to come, they would provide for the department, not just for me, but for the department, the instrumentation to be able to do some of the chemical work that was current.
Excellent, excellent.
Yeah.
So I am assuming the graduate students were more focused, obviously, because it wasn't a means to an end for them. It was an end in itself. It was what their program was in. I seem to recall hearing on numerous occasions that chemistry is one of the hardest majors and has a rather high fallout rate among students. Did you perceive that as true here at the university?
Well, it's difficult for many people, but it is very satisfying for others. It's one of the courses that people either love or hate. Often when I find a physician at USC who is an undergraduate at USC, they have taken either my organic chemistry course or one of the other professors' beginning chemistry course. And they always have stories to tell about how this changed them, how this made them, that sort of thing. So it's a difficult course, but not because it's really because of the memorization, but because of the conceptual nature of it. So
how did you interact with your undergraduate students? You know I have reasons for asking that.
Well, you know, it was a course in which you had to maintain high standards, and we tried to always provide students as much help as they could use with, you know, discussion sections, laboratory sections, teaching assistants, that sort of thing. But many students found it really quite stressful because they knew as well as anybody that if they didn't do well in organic chemistry, or they were going to have difficulty with their MCATs and you know, with applications to medical schools and stuff like that. So they were often fairly stressed.
So one other piece of inside information I have is, how about the physical facility where the class was taught?
Well, yes, our organic chemistry course, 322A and B, was taught at that time in the second and third stories of the administration building.
Oh, okay.
There were two large lecture halls up on the second and third floor, and they held, you know, roughly 200 students each. And so the lectures were there. It wasn't air conditioned, it was sort of stuffy, and it was hard to keep people's attention and keep them awake. And so then we built a new chemistry building, the MUD building. I was the departmental representative to the building committee on that, so I had a chance to participate in the design of the lecture halls and laboratories and those sorts of things, and it's still there.
Yeah.
So.
You mentioned your committee service on that. You've had a variety of governance activities here. Can you talk about some of those?
Yeah, I've been on a number of different committees. I think I've close to every committee at some point. but anyway, I did. It was something that I found satisfying. A lot of my colleagues didn't like working on committees much because, I don't know, they didn't enjoy the interactions and the give and take and the background work you needed to do. But I found that I could work on committees and, you know, get things done, but I also could take a leadership role and sort of steer the committee in a direction that I thought we should be going, and convince my colleagues to come along. So that's always a good thing. I ended up chairing the university's budget advisory committee. I had gotten on the budget advisory committee at the request of Bob Biller, who was then the vice provost, I believe. And I learned so much from him about how the university functions, you know, what the budget priorities were, what the consequences of making various decisions were. So that was really an eye-opener for me. And then I chaired the budget committee for a couple of years. I'd been involved in the faculty senate. It was the faculty senate at that point. It's now the academic senate for several years, and had chaired the compensation committee and the faculty rights and responsibilities committee and stuff like that, and eventually became president of the faculty senate. So I was involved in that. I also eventually became the president of the board of directors of the USC Faculty Center. The Faculty Center had started on a building project, and it was a project that many people said was not well conceived because it was a design, build, and pay-as-you-go.
Yeah.
So the design would come, the builder would build it, and the faculty center would have to pay for it. And they ended up in a position where they didn't have money to finish the project, and so for a couple of years it sat there as a unfinished project, as sort of an eyesore to everybody. And I guess it was Neil Pings at the point asked me whether I'd be willing to chair the board and try to get the thing back on track and get it finished. So I did that.
Great. You also were very involved in mentoring students and serving on thesis committees for them. Would you talk about that? I seem to recall that just about every year after a certain point, you had at least one and sometimes two students that you were serving as a thesis advisor.
Yes, I usually had 2 or 3 students most of the time. And most of the students were from backgrounds where they needed some assistance with their background training. I'm most satisfied in the laboratory. I consider myself always have a laboratory chemist, and so I like doing work in the laboratory, and so I was able to work alongside my students in the laboratory and teach them techniques and help them to make observations and things like that. So that was good. And then while I was an assistant professor, I think maybe my second or third year, the young rebel chemistry professors decided that we needed to revamp our qualifying procedures for the PhD candidates. So we rewrote the rules and did the qualifying examination procedures, and that was a good thing to do also. It's still in effect now. But as a consequence, I got on a number of dissertation committees, partly because I taught students the graduate level physical organic chemistry course, and most of the graduate students in inorganic or organic chemistry took that course, so they were familiar with me and asked me whether I would serve on their committees. One of the advice I always enjoyed giving students was that when they go into these sorts of exams where they have 5 professors that are going to be examining them, they shouldn't get upset if a professor is going to ask them a question that they don't know the answer to. The professors really, certainly 5 of them, know more than one up-and-coming graduate student, and their purpose was really to find out the limits of the graduate student's knowledge. It wasn't really trying to trick them or anything else, but the way you found the limits was to ask questions they knew the answers to and then move to questions they didn't know the answer to. So the student had to be aware of that and be able to know for themselves whether they knew the answer or not. So. Yeah.
Good advice in so many realms.
Yeah, really. Yeah.
Let's move a little bit forward in history. Most people that I know of do not grow up wanting to be a registrar. What led to you becoming Dean of Academic Records and Registrar for the university?
Well, that's an interesting story too. I didn't really even know what a registrar was for most of my career, for about half of my career here. I was serving on the President's Athletic Advisory Council and had sort of become the statistician for the committee and had had a number of interactions with the Registrar's office. Howard Saperston was in the Registrar, and with the Student Information System, asking queries about the students, how they were doing, what classes they were taking, that sort of stuff. And so I'd gotten fairly familiar with that. And then the university made a decision that they wanted to separate the Registrar's office from the admissions office and make 2 offices. And Pings had decided that he really wanted to have a faculty member as the Dean of Academic Records and Registrar, as they called it. They had a search committee, and after a few months they didn't end up with a candidate they were interested in. So Bob Biller came to me and he said, well, Servis, he says, I know that you're going to be at the university for most of your career, and you need to serve the university as well as serve yourself. So I'm asking you whether you will do this position for 3 years as a service to the university. I was real hesitant about this because I'd seen so often that people who moved into these administrative positions did not really come back and had trouble restarting their research programs. But I was fairly interested in that aspect, and so I agreed to do it for 3 years. And then after 3 years, we got started on some programs that we didn't quite finish. And so I told Pings, well, I haven't really quite finished these 2 projects, so could you give me 2 more years and then I'll go back? And he said at that point, well, he says, why don't we just make an agreement that you can go back whenever you choose to go back and not necessarily after 5 years. So I did, and the more I became involved, the more satisfaction I received from being in that position, and so I stayed on for the rest of my career at USC, so from '89 until 2011.
22 years.
Yes.
The first 3-year hitch became 22.
It became 22, correct. Yeah.
What was it you hoped to achieve when you took the job, so for the first 3-year period? Well,
when I first took the job, I really didn't know enough about the Registrar's office to set any clear goals. But as soon as I got there, it became quite evident that the major shortcoming was our inability to inform students of the progress they were making towards their degrees. Students would come up for their senior degree check and would be told in their last semester, well, I'm sorry, you didn't meet such and such requirement. And the students would be, how did you tell me now? Why didn't you tell me when I could do something? So that was very clear that we needed to do something there, and we looked for ways of trying to provide better progress reports to students. I became aware of a program that was being developed in Ohio that provided academic reporting for students, and convinced the university to make a purchase of this. It was a substantial amount of money at the time, and then we put it on a fast-track development to get it installed. I think probably a record rate for that sort of a program, but we took it sort of in a different way than many schools had. Many schools have since tried to implement it by having it implemented by the various departments and schools and having sort of a grassroots thing. We took it the other way around. We had a good idea of what the requirements were, so we wrote all the requirements into the program and then went back to the schools and said, okay, this is what we understand, what do you understand? And so it allowed us to really fast track the development of the degree progress reporting system. So, and I think it was very successful.
I would agree, but I'm prejudiced in the matter.
Yes.
I think one of the most telling results of it is the increase in our 4- and 5-year graduation rates that followed.
Yes, it has made a huge difference. We were in the low 50s in the early 1990s, and it clearly was not a satisfactory situation. There were a couple things that helped us along a little bit. One was we had at that time a math skill level requirement. And it was supposed to be a requirement so that students could be placed at the appropriate math skill level when they started their academic careers at USC. Well, it turned out that a whole bunch of these students never satisfied the skill level requirement, and they ended up in their senior year having not satisfied that, but clearly they had the skills to get there. So it became obvious that we really needed to rethink what the skill level requirement was and what we intended to do with it. So that was part of it. The other part was then becoming much more proactive in informing students how they were progressing, what they needed to do, being sure that all the advisors in the schools took responsibility for the students in their schools. And now we're just above 90% in our graduation rate. And that's a huge difference.
It is, it is.
Yeah.
Well, I know also your degree progress office started offering Advisor 101 training.
Yes.
To help the departmental advisors. You want to talk a little bit about that and how that came about?
Yes. Well, it also became clear as part of this, we needed the advisors in the department to take more responsibility for the students' progress in their department, and so we needed to really train them about not only what their own department requirements were, if you're a chem major you need to take this, this, and this, but also what the rest of the university requirements were. You needed to satisfy your general education requirements, your distribution requirements, these sorts of things. So they started the Advisor 101 program to help the advisor of the department help their students along.
Great. What other initiatives would you like to mention?
Well, there were several. One, of course, was the conversion of our registration system from a card system to a touch-tone registration system. In the 1980s, after computers became readily available and computer cards became available, we used to register students by having them go to the departments and get a computer card which said that they could register in a particular section of a course. They then had to bring the computer card back to a central location, and because we had all of these students trying to do this at the same time, we usually used the big gym for the central registration place. And there would be lines out the door. Students would stand in line for hour, 2 hours. that sort of thing. So we reorganized the registration system, and a key to that was being able to do online, or not really online, touchtone registration. So we brought in a touchtone registration system where students could register using the keypad on a touchtone phone, get their course assignments and do all this sort of stuff, and not have to come to the office to be able to do that. And that, that was a big transition to online registration, which is the way things are done now. The other part that we did in the mid to late 1990s was to put in a touchscreen kiosk. I had seen touchscreen kiosks for ATMs and that sort of thing, and we were looking for some way of being able to provide an ATM-like experience for students where they could come in and enter information, their ID card or something like that, get in touch with the computer system that had their records and see what they needed to do, what their bills were, what their restrictions were, all those sorts of things. And so at one of the conferences, I think it was an ACRO conference, there was a company there called TouchNet. And TouchNet was a company that had developed a touchscreen kiosk for truckers so that they could keep in contact with their home bases and get instruction for loads and stuff like that. And they were trying to branch out into universities to provide a kiosk for students to be able to fax information, print information and stuff like that, but they didn't really have the idea of connecting to the student information system. So we talked and I convinced them that it was worth a try, and they agreed. So we went to a joint development agreement and developed the software through the Student Information System group, thank you, and put in then this touchscreen kiosk system where students could go up and find out all this sort of stuff. And that was very successful, but of course times changed. The internet came along, and you didn't really need to go to a touchscreen kiosk anymore. You could go to your computer, and so the touchscreen kiosk system was very valuable at the time, but it's no longer necessary to.
Right.
So.
You had mentioned before you accepted the position that Dr. Biller had expressed a desire to have a faculty member in the role. How did your coming from the faculty impact how the job was done? Perhaps made it easier, perhaps made it more difficult, maybe a little bit of both?
Well, it was interesting because, as a faculty member, if you're chairing the curriculum committee, you're not the outsider who doesn't understand curriculum. You know what the curriculum is and what that's all about. So it gives you a ready access to your colleagues, and you can talk much more directly and openly. And I think that was a big difference. I was considered much more of a colleague to my faculty colleagues than I was a bureaucrat who was pushing paper. Mm-hmm. So that was a big advantage. And I could also call on people that I knew. If I needed help with a committee or I needed help with the project or something, I could get them to serve more readily, I think, than I could have if I had not had my prior experience, not just my title, but my prior experience working with the faculty.
I know one of the things that occurred under your watch was the turnaround time on final grade submission was drastically reduced. So students had some sense of what they had gotten in their classes before it was time to register finally for the next. And I know there was pushback from some of the faculty as the deadlines were shrunk. Did the fact that you came from the faculty help win the day in some of those arguments?
Well, I think it probably did. You're right about the difficulty with the grade reporting. The grade reporting hadn't really been very carefully monitored. And so the registrar's office would just accept the grades as they were turned in, and they would remind departments when they were late, but they didn't really do anything about it if they were late and then late and then late. And so what we decided to do was to not only inform the faculty that they were late, but their department chairs that there were grades missing and that these needed to be processed. The provost was very supportive, and he established a deadline then for reporting grades, which was just a few days after the end of the grading period, which once you have the grades in, then you can process them. The processing of grades in a typical student information system is a batch process. It's one of those things that you don't want to do a batch process in which you have half of the stuff, because the other half has to then be hand entered. Right. So you wait and wait and wait trying to get enough there. So with a batch process, you need to have as much available as you can right away, and if you can get people to respond to that, then that works very well. We also then started publishing the departments who had their grades in on time all the time. So we didn't publish the ones that didn't, but you could tell the difference.
Yeah, who's not on the list?
Who's not on the list, right? So that worked out well. It also helped us a great deal with degree progress, with degree posting, I should say. You can't post degrees, obviously, until you get the grades in. And in the 80s, starting into the 90s, it was often several months before the degrees could be fully processed and the degrees posted. And then you didn't didn't issue diplomas, didn't order diplomas until you had the degrees posted. So the degrees weren't posted often until a month or two after the grades were in, and then it was another month or two before the diplomas came. And so by that time, the students had sort of forgotten. They knew they graduated, but they were gone. So that helped a lot. We made a big progress there, and we also got in touch with some companies that would allow us to file our diploma request electronically, and then also provide them with the mailing address, and they would then do the mailing, the printing and the mailing directly, so that improved turnaround time also.
I see a couple of themes overarching that cover the period that you served. One is customer service, whether the customer is the student, departmental advisors, other faculty, and the other is implementation of technology. It seems like those two married, as a matter of fact, under your watch.
Yes. Well, and one supports the other, of course. Without technology, you can't offer good customer service in the current environment. So, yeah, and those are both things very interesting. We had a very active customer service training program in the department for our departmental staff, and we instituted every 6-month customer service award. So the staff got to nominate their colleagues for what they thought who they thought were providing good customer service, and that was appropriately named eventually the Fred Deere Award. Fred Deere was an associate registrar who was sort of the model of good customer service. So, yeah, we did that.
Great. During this time, in your administrative roles, did you have any particular mentors or people you looked to for advice or examples?
Well, Bob Biller continued to be a good advisor, even at times in which he wasn't really involved in directing me or anything like that. And the other one was Sylvia Manning. Sylvia Manning was she's a vice provost. I can't remember whether she's provost or vice provost. And she was really very helpful in sort of guiding me about what to focus on and what things were best just left to be. I had a couple of run-ins with people on campus that hadn't agreed with what I did, and rather than engage them in a continuing struggle over that, she just suggested, well, you've done what you can do, go on, do something else. So that was also a very good piece of advice. So
knowing which battles to fight and which ones to leave behind.
Exactly, right, yeah.
Talk to me about your experience with your staff in the Registrar's office.
Well, the staff was mostly a long-term staff when I came. Mm-hmm. They'd been there mostly several years and had been unaccustomed to having an academic supervisor. Mm-hmm. But we got along well. We met, I instituted a weekly meeting with all the senior staff. we would eat, or we would meet and eat
and eat.
on Friday morning, early Friday morning. And that was really very helpful for me because they were educating me. I was the outsider who didn't know what was going on so much. And so they did that and also gave us a chance to talk about where our problem areas were and where we needed to go. And then in hiring new staff, we were always conscious of the need to hire staff who were really customer service oriented, who really were anxious to provide students with help and to be engaged in their progress towards their degrees. So that was a new thing for me, actually, because the thing I worried most about, I guess, when I took the job was the fact that I had never really supervised anybody. I had graduate students, but that's entirely different. Right. You're more collaborative there. But this office had a staff of about 80 people, and that was a lot of people to keep an eye on. And so, but it worked out well. I mean, I learned to work with the staff, and I think they eventually came to trust me and appreciated the fact that I was really trying to help them. So, yeah.
I can attest to the truth of that since I know so many of them so well. Let's move a little higher level. What changes did you see in the university, even going back to when you started as an assistant professor?
Well, it's been huge. Norman Topping was the president when I first hired on. He was very involved in the university and the academic part of it, as well as being, I guess, a good fundraiser. I wasn't really much aware of the fundraising part of the university at that point, but he was very much respected by the faculty and was really a good president. One interesting story is that when I hired on, I was not quite 25, and the university's position was that they wouldn't contribute any retirement money to somebody who wasn't 30 years old.
I remember this.
And so I said, well, that's the important part, is the early part, not the last part. And so I went to TI Cref and I had them do a study of the difference between starting at 25 and starting at 30 in your retirement planning. And it came back, of course, a huge difference.
Right.
I attended a faculty senate meeting and gave this report to the Senate, and Norman Topping was there, and he said, Carl, is this too? Carl Franklin was the vice president for business affairs.
Right.
And Carl said, yes, it's true. He says, too many of these young faculty don't stay, and we just lose the money. They go off and go someplace else. And Topping said, well, that's not right. Let's change that. So
very good.
Right there and then he said, okay, we're going to change policy. So that was neat. He was a very effective president. Next president was, of course,
John Hubbard.
John Hubbard, and then Jim Zumberg, and then Steve Sample. Steve Sample, I think, was also an excellent president. He was very engaged in the university, also the intellectual part of the university. He was also a great fundraiser, set good goals for achievement, and I think he was probably one of the best presidents we've had, certainly in my experience. So.
Really transformative, right?
Yeah, very transformative, right, yep. So in terms of student quality, the student quality has soared, even after 1995, when we started really becoming much more selective. It was hard to believe that we could make such progress in such short time. In 15 years, we really changed the nature of the undergraduate population that was coming in.
I know it. I was here at the time, and I began as an undergraduate in fall of '78 and was a national merit finalist and a few other things. And USC really didn't recruit me. And I noticed the change when I became more involved with the admissions side of the house, when they would actively recruit students of that caliber and other indicators and really go after them. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the students, I think now we're working on transformative faculty, and really doing everything we can.
Mm-hmm. Joe Allen was very instrumental in initiating that, and Catherine Harrington has been very effective at continuing that, and I think we really are on an upward slope, so it's been good.
All right. So while we're up at this level, looking back, What things are you most proud of in your tenure? And is there anything you wish you could have done over?
Well, let's see, most proud of and could have done over. Well, there's several things that I'm proud of. I did some very good chemical research as a young assistant professor. And I did some work that's still well cited and well thought of, and that to me was very important. So that was good. Developing the department, I'm also very proud of. The department is in a much better position now than when I came. And I take some credit for that. I'm not the only person who contributed to that, but we ended up with 2 Nobel Prize winners, big achievement. Right. So that on that side was that. I really did a career change at USC. I was a faculty member and I was the administrator, and I really didn't realize at the time how much of a difference it was going to make in my life. But I think at the time I made the transition from one to the other, it was really time for me to do that. I had done a lot in the academic side, but I think it also was necessary to have new challenges and open up new areas, and I'm glad I did that. I'm proud of what we were able to do with the student information system tools to help students along, increase the graduation rate, help students get through in less time, those sorts of things. What would I have done differently? Well, I don't know. Life has a long path, and it's not a straight path. It's if there's a Y in the road, take it. So I'm not sure that I would really have changed things because I don't know where I would have ended up if I had. Right. I'm pleased that I was able to work for the university as long as I did. I'm proud of the university. I think it's a place that's done well by me and my family, so it's been good.
Looks like Bob Biller was right. You weren't leaving, right?
That's right.
He said you were going to be here.
Right. Exactly. He knew.
He knew.
Yeah.
All right. One final question. What advice would you give up-and-coming administrators and faculty members about how to make a difference at USC?
Well, I think it really is like most other things in life. You need to find things that interest you, that you have a passion about, and pursue it. You can't follow somebody else's path. You have to follow your own, whether it be as an educator, a researcher, an administrator. And you don't always know where the path is going to go. Hopefully it'll be a good path, but you don't know that. But I think it's really important for people to find their own way and follow their own path and find things that they're really interested in and have a passion about. So, yeah.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.